This is Natalie Clifford Barney. She was a writer, a poet, a playwright, an essayist, a memoirist. Born in Dayton, Ohio in 1876, she settled permanently in Paris in 1898. For many years, Natalie Barney hosted a weekly salon at her home in Paris, which brought together writers, thinkers, artists, and cultural figures of all kinds, and exerted a great influence on the Parisian 20th century literary and artistic scene. Natalie Barney's father, Albert Barney, was a partner in a successful business manufacturing railway vehicles, and she was born into the wealth and privilege of the American Gilded Age business elite. This picture, taken around 1889, shows Natalie as a child with her family at their holiday home in Bar Harbor, Maine. Natalie spent much time in Europe with her mother when young, and was partly educated in France. Her mother, Alice Pike Barney, was a painter and patron of the arts. She gave the household a strongly artistic and somewhat bohemian character, and was a dominant influence on both Natalie and her younger sister, Laura, who both, in their different ways, led creative and unconventional lives. Today, Natalie Barney is remembered as much for her sexual and emotional life and her relationships as for her writings and her literary and cultural influence. She has become a lesbian icon. "Love has always been the main business of my life," she wrote in old age, and that love was for women, passionately and exclusively. Natalie Barney lived openly as a lesbian and had many affairs, some long-lasting, some fleeting. The painter, Romain Brooks, the writer, Colette, the aristocrat, Elizabeth de Gramont, the courtesan, Liane de Pougy, were just a few of her many lovers. She was promiscuous, passionate, and scandalous. She sought out the pleasure of sex for its own sake, treated her lovers badly on occasion, in short, lived in a way that made her notorious, but which would not have raised an eyebrow if she had been a man. She had become aware of her nature, according to her own account, at an early age, and had resolved to remain uncompromisingly true to herself. "At 12," she wrote, "I knew exactly what I liked, and I firmly decided not to let myself be diverted from my tastes." Natalie Barney was as striking in appearance, with strong expressive features, piercing blue eyes, and a cloud of golden hair, as she was in personality, and she always attracted the attention of artists. She had her portrait painted many times, beginning when she was still a child. Her mother, Alice Pike Barney, painted several portraits of Natalie herself over the years, and there are other important portraits by family friend Carole S. Duran and by Natalie's lover, Romain Brooks. She was the subject of sculptures, too. Her sister Laura made a bust of her in 1910, along with a full-figure sculpture of an entirely unclothed Natalie, which caused such alarm when displayed on the lawn of the Barney family home in Pittsburgh that the police came and covered it with a sheet. This figure, l'Amazone, by the Ukrainian sculptor Chana Orlov, who lived in Paris between the two world wars, was inspired by Natalie, who had first been called the Amazon in her teenage years, when she gained a reputation as a daring horsewoman who always rode astride rather than side-saddle. Of all the artistic depictions of Natalie Barney, this is probably one of the least known. It was painted in Paris in about 1900 by the Polish artist Olga Boznańska. In 1900, Natalie Barney was newly arrived in Paris with her sister and her mother. Alice Pike Barney quickly became a well-known figure in the Parisian artistic world. She was involved in an art academy set up by her friend Whistler, which soon led to the establishment of a regular artistic salon which met in her apartment. and it was through this that Olga Boznańska came into the Barneys' social circle. Olga, who had herself only been settled in the French capital for a little over a year, often came to the salon to paint and to talk about art. Olga Boznańska was born in Krakow in 1865 and trained in Poland and later in Munich. As a woman, she was excluded from the Royal Academy of the Fine Arts in Munich, so followed the path of many female artists and trained at private schools run by academic painters. In later years, she described the artistic training she received during this period as a complete waste of time. From early in her career, Boznańska wanted to follow her own artistic path. She set up a studio in Munich in 1889, taking pupils of her own and joining the Munich succession, and actively pursued opportunities to exhibit and to make her name and her work known. She visited Paris frequently and was closely in touch with artistic developments there, even before she settled permanently in 1898. She achieved her aim of exhibiting widely, and by 1900 had won prizes for her paintings in Warsaw, Munich, Vienna, and London. Her work was well regarded. The Burlington magazine described the portraits she exhibited at the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts in 1910 as the strongest and most interesting in the show, and praised her work for showing psychological insight as well as great technical ability. Boznańska was best known as a figure painter and a portraitist. Whistler was an important influence on her work, reflecting the prevalence of symbolist and aesthetic ideas in late 19th century Paris, as was Manet, and, as with Manet, her works were sometimes criticized for appearing to be unfinished. The old master whose influence she chiefly acknowledged was Velázquez, whose work she kept constantly by her, maintaining a collection of reference prints of his portraits. She was very aware of contemporary artistic trends, but also very clear about her own direction, rejecting, for example, any connection between her work and Impressionism. She is now seen essentially as a post-Impressionist, drawing on Impressionist techniques, but concerned with interior rather than exterior experience, with psychological and emotional content, and the subjective perceptions of the viewer. Boznańska's style involved the flattening of figures, a restricted but powerful palette, and an exceptional ability to convey character and psychological insight. An article about Olga Boznańska's portraiture, published in the American Magazine of Art in October 1917, described her as not interested in small detail. What interests her is, first and last and all the time, the character of her sitter. Not every good painter has this woman's genius for delineating character. She wrote of her own work that she had little interest in line. The arrangement of shapes against a background and the use of pattern, always significant in Whistler's portraits, were less important for Boznańska than were issues of form and colour, which in turn gave expression to atmosphere, character, and psychology. The gaze is important in Boznańska's portraits. The sitter's eyes are often painted with emphatic clarity and look directly out at the viewer. All these characteristics are on display in her portrait of Natalie Barney. We do not know the precise date when this portrait was painted, but it was almost certainly some time in 1900. It would have been painted at one of Alice's artistic salons. Natalie and Laura regularly attended their mother's artistic gatherings and would sit for portraits. On this occasion, Natalie, wearing a green dress and jewellery including a ring with a green stone and a long necklace, was the sitter. During this sitting, Olga Boznańska painted her portrait, and Alice Pike Barney seems to have produced two portraits, one in oils and one in pastel. All three portraits are today in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The museum dates the pastel by Alice Pike Barney to circa 1895. but it shows Natalie in the same posture, with the same accessories, and against the same background as the other pictures, so it seems highly likely that it was produced at the same time. Boznańska was infamous for painting very slowly. Apparently, Alice was able to paint 2 portraits of Natalie in the time it took Olga to paint 1. All 3 portraits are relatively small, suitable for painting on an easel indoors, with Boznańska's portrait being somewhat larger than the 2 painted by Alice Pike Barney. The pastel showing Natalie Barney in profile was painted on canvas, while Alice Barney's other painting of her daughter, and Boznańska's painting, are on fibreboard. Fibreboard, manufactured by compressing wood fibers to produce thin, light panels, was an invention of the 1860s and was primarily intended for use in furnishing and interior decoration. Artists adopted fiberboards for painting in the later 19th century, liking their lightness, cheapness, and convenience compared to canvas, and the first fiberboards manufactured specifically for artists appeared in the early 1890s. Some boards were manufactured smooth, others had a textured surface impressed into one or both sides using patterned rollers. Fiberboard was fragile, however. It tended to warp, and the surface could be difficult to prepare. Not until hardboard became available, in the form of masonite in the 1920s, were these problems solved for artists, at least to some degree. Olga Boznańska preferred boards to canvas for much of her work. In this case, her painting has survived in better condition than Alice Barney's, which has suffered considerable damage around the edges. It also has a marked texture on the painted side, which contributes greatly to the character of the finished work, whereas Alice's board has a smooth surface. Alice Barney's salons were held in a bedroom of her apartment in central Paris. In this relatively small room full of easels and of people painting, being painted, and talking about painting, boards and light wooden panels, quick and convenient to set up and easy to store, would have been ideal supports for painting exercises. The light source is to Natalie's right, so on the left side of the paintings, but this is a point of more significance to Barney than to Boznańska, who looked to bodies of colour rather than representations of the fall of light as her main means of defining form. Boznańska, unlike Alice Barney, was evidently sitting directly in front of Natalie as she painted. Was this choice or chance? She may well have preferred the direct, full-frontal viewpoint as suiting her style better. She favoured such a viewpoint in many of her portraits, which enabled her to emphasize faces and the eyes of the sitter. Boznańska sought an effect of flatness in her portraits, to such a degree that she stopped varnishing her work, believing that varnish interfered both with the flatness of her forms and the vibrancy of her colours. One of her reasons for using board rather than canvas for many of her paintings was that she liked her paints to sink into the surface, an effect with which Manet, along with other avant-garde painters of the era, also experimented, and which would be a key practice of the American colour-field abstract painters of the later 20th century. This quality of flatness did indeed become much discussed later in the century in connection with abstraction, but its history, viewed in a longer perspective of modernist painting, makes clear that it had no necessary connection with, or inevitable trajectory of development towards, abstract art. Boznańska is very present as a painter in her work, as is evidence of her painting process, through her brushstrokes, the layering of paint, and her creation of fields and interactions of colour. The portrait shows the sitter, as we have said, full face, and looking directly at the viewer. She is sitting in a chair which is not square on, but is angled to the viewer's left. The arm of the chair can be seen in the lower right, with her left elbow propped on it, and her forearm raised, so that she can rest her chin in her left hand. Accordingly, the oval of her face is slightly off-centre, displaced to the sitter's left, while the body is off-centre to the sitter's right, disrupting the otherwise full-face alignment of the figure and creating a sense of both movement and containment. Natalie's right hand lies flat in her lap, with the fingers slightly spread. She is wearing a dark green dress, and on her left hand is a ring with a dark green stone. She is also wearing a necklace, the flickering form of which can just be made out against the green of her dress. It is a long necklace, typical of the time. She has looped it over her hand so that it hangs down in front of her. A long tress of her red-gold hair falls across the front of Natalie's dress. Her bright blue eyes look straight at us, in a gaze both challenging and contemplative. Boznańska has prepared her surface with a pinkish-brown ground, which can be seen most clearly where it is exposed along the right-hand edge of the painting. The palette Boznańska uses in this portrait is characteristically restricted and muted, with an overall scheme of red-green complementaries, and there is little brightness or contrast. Bluey green, olive green, browns ranging from darkly reddish to golden-hued, greys that range from dark to light, flesh colours composed of pink, grey, and blends of red and brown. It is with colour that Boznańska creates the forms of her composition, forms which, when looked at individually, seem to blend into one another and lose definition, but which cohere and acquire identity when the picture is viewed as a whole. Her colouring is curious and quite her own, wrote Amelia de Vries in her article on Boznańska in the American Magazine of Art. It is strong, but not pure. She seems never to see colours separately, but always as if each one contained in itself something of the others. She loses the distinctness of outline purposely. A lesser artist would simply arrive at confusion by this method, but she seems to see the world as a confusion, out of which certain characters emerge. With each of her portraits you feel she has overcome the world. Boznańska's paint is often thick, and the brushstrokes show clearly, but this effect is never heavy enough to approach impasto, which would have interfered with the flatness of finish she sought. Boznańska often emphasized hands in her portraits, and here the right hand of Natalie Barney, on the left-hand side of the picture, not only gives definition to her figure, but serves to bring it forward in the picture space. The tension between this forward motion and the way the rest of her form tends to sink into the background is responsible for some of the atmosphere of tension that emanates from this portrait. The background is very loosely sketched in, with quickly applied areas of colour that mingle with each other, suggesting rather than defining the forms which make up the walls, bookshelves, and other furniture that occupy the space behind her. In a manner characteristic of symbolist paintings, the face seems to float amid its aureole of golden hair against this darker background with its indistinct forms, giving an additional air of the uncanny to the portrait. Natalie Barney and Olga Boznańska, one an expatriate American, the other an expatriate Pole, both stayed on in Paris and made it their home for the rest of their lives. Natalie Barney remained a prominent figure in Parisian literary society and hosted her salon for over 60 years. She died in 1972, at the age of 95. Olga Boznańska continued to paint and to take pupils in her studio, and to exhibit successfully in France and overseas. Her last years were clouded by her failing health and by her grief at the fate of Poland at the hands of Russia and Germany at the beginning of the Second World War. She died in 1940.